Good morning. It's good to see that so many of you have decided to pay some attention to this event. My name is Jakub Godzimirski. I am a research professor at NUPI, and I am also one of the co-editors and co-authors of this book that we are going to present today. So the plan is as follows. I will start by saying a few words about the project that this book is a kind of a baby of, and then I will say a few words about the book itself, and then I will invite my two co-authors to join me on the podium to share their ideas about the book, the topics that this book deals with, and then we will have some discussion among ourselves, and then we will of course open for questions from the audience. So starting with in telling you words about this project. The project was called Consequences of Investments for National Security. Project came about because NUPI applied for funding and received funding, very generous funding from the Research Council of Norway to conduct this project. The project started already in 2019, and we look forward to concluding this project this year. This event is most probably one of the last events related to this project. The question this project asked was as follows. How can liberal open societies reap the benefits of open economies but at the same time protect their legitimate security interests? This is at the very core of the project. And then we also have to understand that how those questions have been addressed during this 5-6 years of the project, dependent also very much on the developments beyond the project. When the project was started in 2019, this was, for instance, the year when, on the 1st of January 2019, a new law on security was implemented in Norway. This new law on security put some new framework for Norwegian thinking about foreign investments, and this new law on security was also an expression of the interest into adapting this new law to new changing framework conditions. And after having a conversation with Kim Trovik, who played a key part in preparing the work for this new law on security, he somehow identified 3 topics that were the main drivers of the work on this new law on security. The first topic was that in 2019, or even before, especially in 2014, the international environment changed, because until 2014 we still used to live in this era of long post-Cold War peace, but in 2014 the major European power decided to use military power in order to grab territory of its neighbor. So this was this change in the kind of broader framework of international environment. Then there was also the idea that our thinking about security must be also influenced by the changes in the technological sphere, because we have somehow discovered very quickly that many elements of, for instance, critical infrastructure have been digitalized. The operations of the critical infrastructure have been digitalized, and this was maybe one of the major technological developments that somehow made people think in new ways about the issue of protection of critical infrastructure, which is important for the functioning of societies. And this critical infrastructure was also believed to be possibly exposed to some challenges coming from this changing international environment. So this was the second element of thinking behind this new law on security. And then there was the third element. There was this realization that in order to deal with those more complex issues, you need to have a better coordination of the efforts on the part of the state. In Norway, we have until 2019, and this is still very much the case, the situation when dealing with questions related to national security, but also to questions related to security of critical infrastructure was very much an issue that was departmentalized, in the sense that there were ministries that were responsible for the areas to deal with challenges, but there was no kind of an overall an overall approach where one could coordinate those efforts in order to address those new types of challenges. And of course, the issue of the economic statecraft, the issue of how economic instruments could be used in order to impose some ideas, in order to influence national security, has also become very clearly visible after 2014, because we understand, for instance, that the reason why this strong energy interdependence had been established between Russia and some parts of Europe played also a part in for instance, in Russian strategic calculation. So the question of the impact economic instruments of power could have on national security also become very much actualized after 2014 for various types of reasons. So this project decided to look into how the use of those various types of economic instruments of power could impact national security in Norway, but also in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the globe. And we also understood that in order to identify the challenges and figure out how one could deal with those challenges, both at the academic level, because this issue has also become a topic very much discussed in the academic circles, but had also a lot of importance for those who design and implement policies. So we also understood that in order to be able to present some findings and conclusions and have a say in the policy-making process, it was important to look at how those issues are dealt with by various types of international institutions and actors. The EU was obviously one of the actors that came and decided to introduce some solutions in order to be able to monitor and screen foreign investments that were at the time viewed as the most important connection between various types of actors. So we decided to look at various solutions that were to address this new type of challenges emerging in this new technological and international environment. And then we also decided to invite some colleagues from other parts of Europe and from other parts of the world in order to contribute to share their knowledge with us on how those questions related to this new emerging security environment are addressed in their context. And what we also decided to do was that in order to understand what are the Western responses to this new type of challenges, we also decided to share our insights about how those Western ideas on how to deal with questions related to economic statecraft, use of economic instruments of power, to how this connection between economy and national security is thought about. We decided also to look at the policies of two countries that are most often referred to as posing the most important challenge to the collective West. So we decided also that we had to have a presentation of how Russia has been approaching those questions related to economic power, foreign investments, and how those questions could could have impacted Russian national security and security policy. And then we also decided that having in mind the growing importance of China on the international stage, that we also had to look into how those questions are related by the Chinese policymakers, policy-making community, by the Chinese expert community, and so on. And this was a kind of background for the work on this book. The book was published only 2 months ago by Palgrave Macmillan in the very prestigious series on international political economy. This is the main product of this project, and this book presents the main findings of the project presented by a group of partners from Norway and from other parts of Europe. The book consists of 9 chapters. The 2 first chapters somehow present some general ideas about the connection between economic power, economic statecraft, the use of economic instruments of power, and how they may impact on the situation on the national security and more broadly on various aspects of security. Then in chapter number 2, we also looked in more detail into how those questions related to Chinese and Russian investments in Europe could be addressed, because we understood that in order to be able to understand the policy choices made by both the European institutions but also by national authorities, we had to have a relatively detailed map of what kind of challenge those Chinese and Russian investments in Europe posed to economic safety, economic security, to societal security, and so on. So we had a colleague who wrote his PhD about Chinese investments in Europe based on a very detailed examination of various types of available sources, and he contributed to this chapter with presenting a kind of very detailed map of Chinese and Russian investments in Europe, because we understood that discussion about security and investments was in the European context very much about investments coming from Russia, and even more so the ones coming from China. The whole debate about Huawei and to what extent it would be wise to allow Huawei develop our critical infrastructure is a very good exemplification of this debate at the European level. In the Norwegian context, we saw, for instance, what happened around this idea that one of the relatively small Norwegian companies was to be sold to Russian interests, when we discovered that this company is also providing some services to U.S. Marine Corps, to the Norwegian defense structures, and so on. And so this is a very good illustration of how those questions had to be addressed. So in this second chapter, we looked at how those Russian and Chinese investments in Europe could be viewed as posing a threat or a challenge or a risk to national security. Then we had several chapters that dealt with national approaches and international approaches. Unfortunately, Charlotte Hafstad, who contributed with a chapter on European EU approach to the issue of monitoring of and screening of foreign investments, was not able to join us today for health-related reasons. But she did not only study on, she wrote not only a study about the European approach to foreign investments as a security challenge, risk, or threat, but she also decided to look more closely at how those questions have been addressed by the German and the Norwegian authorities. So this chapter also deals very much with the question of new law on security in Norway. And I can also mention that Charlotte Hafstad was also a member of this committee that was to develop a new Norwegian approach to foreign investments, a state-formed national commission on those questions. And then we had several chapters covering national policies. Tim Sweijs, who sits here in the first row, contributed together with his Dutch colleague a chapter on the Dutch approaches to those questions. Then we had two colleagues from Finland presenting and sharing with us the insights about the Finnish approaches to questions related to investments. One could say that Finland is not very high on the map of foreign investments, but Finland has a very interesting relationship with Russia. So this issue of how Finland was to deal with investments coming from Russia was something that interested us very much, so we decided to invite them. Then we had a contribution coming from one of our colleagues who decided to look at how those questions are addressed in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. So he contributed with a chapter, Eivind Svensson contributed with a chapter on the UK and American approaches to foreign investments. And then we had also those two chapters dealing with questions related to how Russia has been dealing with this type of challenges that are related to foreign investments. In the case of Russia, it was obvious that when the Soviet project collapsed in 1991, Russia embarked on a kind of deep changes of its political, economic, and foreign policy, and incoming foreign investments were supposed to play a major and mostly positive part in facilitating the transition from the old system to the new one. But then some challenges emerged that made Russian policymakers adopt a more cautious and reluctant approach to foreign investments. This was already the case under the Yeltsin, but then when Putin came, he decided to even adopt even a more serious and put some more limits on foreign investments and how those foreign investments could influence Russian security policy. And then we also had this chapter on the Chinese approaches to those questions, authored by our colleagues from NUPI, Hans Jørgen Gåsemyr, who is NUPI's main resource on China. So he has contributed with this chapter on the Chinese approach to foreign investments in narrow sense, but also to economic statecraft and use of economic instruments of power, both in terms of China protecting its kind of economic interest against some possible negative influences from abroad, but it was also very much about China becoming a more serious player on the global map of foreign investments. And then, together with Morten Skumsrud Andersen, who also sits in the first row, we also presented some conclusions and some remarks on what needs to be done in this field in order to present even a more complete picture. And I can tell you that when we wrote those concluding remarks, we somehow discovered that the challenge to national security, broadly understood, because our approach to security is a wide one, based very much on the ideas that were presented in this very important book on understanding of security, published already in 1998, called New Framework for Security Studies, where security is not only about tanks and missiles, but also about societal security, economic security, environmental security, and about other aspects of security. So when you look at security from this broad perspective, then you understand that, for instance, the fact that both China and Russia try to influence public opinion in our countries, also to various types of investments. For instance, investments in media, it's also something that those who are responsible for devising and implementing national security policies need to take account of. But in the Western world, in Europe, the debate about relationship between economic activity, foreign investments, and national security was until quite recently focused most almost exclusively on the threats, risks, or challenges posed by those investments coming from countries with whom we don't have very good relationship in terms of security, broadly understood. But then already when we were publishing this final chapter in this book, we discovered that some investment-related challenges and some challenges related to the use of economic instruments of power could come also from a rather unexpected direction from the United States. We knew nothing in February 2024 when we sent this book manuscript to the publisher about the outcome of the presidential elections in the United States, but we understood that if Donald Trump were to come back as the country's new president, this could also pose some challenges. And we identified two topics that we meant could contribute to a gap growing between Europe and the United States. One topic was the issue of different political and business cultures, and this was related to this conflict between the Swedish trade unions working for an American company, Tesla, where they decided to go on strike in order to convince the owners of the company, meaning Elon Musk, to allow them to organize. So this was very much something that got a lot of attention in the Nordic countries, because it was a kind of meeting of two business cultures, where on the one hand there was this idea that those who work for a company need to have also a say on how this company is to develop and so on and so on. So these workers at the Swedish branch of Tesla who wanted to organize in order to strengthen their position towards the owner were not allowed to organize, and this strike is, if I'm not wrong, is still going on. And then the other issue that we identified as a topic that could also cause some problems in relations between Europe and the United States is this idea of imposing an extra tax on those big tech companies, mostly operating and having headquarters in the United States, but reaping a lot of economic benefits from operating in Europe and in other parts of the world. And I think that this would be a very good way of concluding those introductory remarks, because we now experience something that some people refer to as a tectonic shift in the international environment. I started with saying a few words about the importance of those changes in the international environment, how they influence our thinking about security and about the use of economic instruments of power. And now we are in the middle of this tectonic change, changing the very many parameters of cooperation across the Atlantic. And we are still very much in the very early phase of this tectonic change. But it opens also a new areas for research. So we are most probably going to look into various types of funding opportunities to have this project extended in order to address this new type of challenges that definitely emerge not only in relations between those established liberal democracies and those rogue states like Russia and China, but also the impact of the changes in the most important, until quite recently, promoter of those liberal and democratic values need also to be taken into account. So I would like to now invite my two co-authors, Tim and Hans Jørgen, to join me on the podium, and I will challenge you to say a few words about how those questions related to the topics this book is addressing, but also to those quite recent developments in the international environment, how this could somehow be discussed, what we need to understand in order to be able to prepare for how these tectonic changes to influence our daily lives, but also our academic interests. So please, I would like to ask Tim to share his thoughts about those questions. Tim has been involved in discussions on various aspects of security, including economic security. You were, for instance, involved in a very interesting study on the role of various types of flows some years ago, published by the Hague Centre of Security Studies, where Tim is the director for research. So please feel free to share with us your insights, and then I will pose the same intellectual challenge to Hans Jørgen. Please share your insights with us. Thank you. And we will, of course, open for questions from the audience. We have like 1 hour for this exercise, and we will now. I will ask Tim and Hans Jørgen to use between 5 and 10 minutes to present their insights. So we will have also some time for questions coming from the audience. I understand that those who decided to spend 1 hour with us today are more or less very interested in those questions, so we will be very glad to address those questions that you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jakub. And in typing, you have the expression words per minute, but you also have words per minute in talking, and it's always difficult to follow someone like Jakub who has so many words per minute. It's very impressive, Jakub. But first and foremost, thank you for inviting me to participate and contribute to your very important book project, and for inviting me to share some thoughts here. And I think you're right. I think we've entered turbulent times in which the strong do as they please and the weak will have to suffer as they must, as an old Greek thinker once said. And that aligns very well with the larger research program I've been working on for about 2 decades now, I think, which looks into strategies that small and middle powers, such as Norway and the Netherlands, can pursue to protect their security, to promote their prosperity, at the same time while aligning with their core liberal values. And that jibes nicely with a theme that has been quite prevalent in Dutch grand strategy, in line with a book written by Joris Voorhoeven, which talks about peace, profits, and principles. And so Dutch grand strategy, really since the 17th century, can be characterized as a mix of these 3 P's. Peace, profits, and principles. Protect your security, promote your prosperity, and uphold your values. And this is more than merely paying lip service to the triple P's. Principles is even enshrined in the Dutch constitution in Article 90 and Article 97. It says that the Dutch government and the Dutch armed force are there to promote international law. And let's get back to that in our discussion, because promoting international law and international order becomes much harder in times of tectonic shifts, where the so-called protector of the so-called rule-based liberal order is no longer protecting it. So that presents us with a conundrum. But let me share a few thoughts. In that triangles, peace, profits, and principles, the profits were always quite central. In our first economic efflorescence in the early 17th century, in our second economic efflorescence in the late 19th century, we always prioritized profits. And why was that? It has something to do with our Dutch national merchant culture, which really is deeply ingrained in our DNA. But it also explains why we were an imperial power, but never were such a deep imperial power, such as the British and the French. We really always tried to balance the books. Now, following the Second World War, because I realize you only give me between 5 and 10 minutes, the peace, profits, and principles continued by always promoting the transatlantic relationship, with NATO being the cornerstone of our national security. And we had a notion of embedded liberalism for the economist here. So we liberalized our economies, but we had a social welfare state, as many Western European states have, of course. But following the 1980s, we started to further liberalize our markets. Also a very well-known story, the Thatcherite and Reaganite policies and the Washington Consensus. But we did it to such an extent that our government had a really laissez-faire, and I'm not with the government, but I'm speaking as a Dutchman here for a Norwegian audience, had a very laissez-faire approach towards FDI. So laissez-faire that the Netherlands became one of the largest sources and recipients of FDI in the world. I think we're currently second after the Americans. It switches now and then. to a degree that if you look at the amount of FDI that we attract, it's about, I think, 3.5 trillion, which is about 300% of our national GDP, to give you a sense as to how liberal our regimes were. But in that triangle, in that trinity of peace, profits, and principles, the balance between security on the one hand and prosperity on the other hand has started to tilt, unsurprisingly, towards security rather than prosperity. And I've been sort of following closely over the past 2 decades why that is the case, both as a Dutch citizen, someone who's properly interested in it, but also as a researcher. So I've written a couple of pieces on this, have been closely involved in setting up from the sidelines some of these national security mechanisms, and I have a PhD student who is about to finish working on this very topic from an assemblage approach. What I would like to do is, do I have 3-4 minutes? Okay. What I would like to do is to give you a sense of how over the past 2 decades that Dutch context changed, and realizing that this to you may sound like a very peculiar example in line with the title of my chapter, Geographical Dwarf, FDI Giant, Protecting Security and Prosperity, the Peculiar Case of the Netherlands. I thought it could be interesting because rather than talking about the intensification of strategic interstate competition, I can also have many words per minute, rather than talking about the intensification of interstate strategic competition and the digitalization of our societies, and the fact that there is an increasing fear of what illiberal regimes will do to our economies, I thought I would give you a few very concrete examples, which may be interesting because you can look at how that sort of is reflected in the Norwegian case. And so let me mention 4 or 5 developments over the past 2 decades that really had a major impact on the ways in which the Dutch government looked upon FDI and has started regulating it now to such an extent that there is a whole administrative structure in place, there's new laws putting restrictions on FDIs, but most importantly, putting burdens on companies and on investors to notify the government in case they invest in so-called vital sectors. But before we get to that, I wanted to sort of highlight a few events. First, there were the 9/11 attacks, which were followed, of course, with the attacks in 2004 and 2005 in Brussels and Paris. Brussels and Madrid. It was only later in 2015 in France, of course. But we also had some smaller terrorist attacks in the Netherlands, which put, so we call it securitization, which prompted a process in which security awareness was raised and a Dutch national security strategy was developed, and certain mechanisms were put in place to start looking at the protection of vital critical infrastructures. Nothing to do with FDI yet, but it did have to do with a recognition that our vital critical infrastructure could be at risk. Then in 2011, something very interesting happened. There was a very small company, DigiNotar, that provided certificates, quite technical, certificates to companies guaranteeing the reliability of their websites. And if you think, what's that? Well, that's precisely what our Dutch government thought. Many of the ministers who are 60 plus didn't have a clue. And mind you, this is 14 years ago. But the risk was that the large e-tech companies such as Microsoft, Google, Mozilla would withdraw, would no longer allow other companies using DigiNotar certificates to function. Technical story, but long story short, that would mean that the Port of Rotterdam, our national airport Schiphol, our national financial infrastructure would cease to function. That would be really catastrophic. It would be huge. So panic. Finally, the government managed to convince the large e-tech companies to give us an extension and delay, and the blackout situation was averted. But again, this was a wake-up call. Again, there's more wake-up calls in this story, as there is in Europe, to think about the protection of our critical infrastructures. The third event was the fact that there was a Mexican billionaire with the company Mexican America Móvil, who wanted to acquire a controlling majority share in our national telecommunications company, the KPN. And we hadn't realized, the Dutch government hadn't realized that we had liberalized the economy to such an extent that they could invest in critical infrastructure. So they found a very ingenious way around it, launched a foundation who then took over controlling shares, thereby bypassing and outsmarting the Mexican billionaire. But here we are, we went from security awareness to security recognition to an ad hoc reaction towards dealing with a hostile, presumably hostile or a foreign takeover of our critical national, one of our critical national security companies. That was followed by an event in 2015, yes, in which Fox IT, do we know Fox IT here? It's a large ICT security company, which was built by a Dutch former intelligence agent into a really big cybersecurity and cyber protection company, was acquired by the Brits. And the only thing that the CEO of Fox IT did is send an SMS text message, which he did back then, to the Dutch National Security Coordinator, telling them that it was fine, but that he sold all his shares. All of a sudden, the Dutch government thought, that Fox IT is protecting all our critical systems. So again, a wake-up call. Then we had two other things, and then I'm going to hand the floor to my colleague. We had the whole Huawei debate, in which the Dutch were quite skeptical towards the overtures of the Americans, essentially seeing this as a play in the competition over leadership over the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So they were thinking, no, let's not go there. This is not about security. This is about prosperity. This is about economics, and it doesn't suit us. But for a variety of reasons, which both have to do with power ships across the Atlantic, but also within Europe, we saw that first the Brits went along and then the French went along. And there were also quite some convincing briefings behind the scenes that giving Huawei access to not just the nodes, some of the external hubs in the network, but also the central nodes, would be a real security threat. So here restrictions were placed, again an anecdote, but on the admission of a foreign company or foreign entity in your critical infrastructure. Now, by then, and now we're talking from 2019 onwards, the balance had really tilted. Think back of my Trinity, from peace, profits, and principles, where profits always won. This was now about peace, and peace seen as security, national security. And so ever since, the government has been developing a number of laws and mechanisms and agencies that see to the ways in which foreign entities can control, or rather cannot exert control over assets that are considered to be critical to Dutch national security and prosperity. And we can go into the technical details, if you like, in a moment. But I thought this would set us up for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very interesting and timely and highly relevant comments. Hans Jørgen.
All right. Thank you. Just let me start by thanking you, Jakub and Martin, for editing the book and all your hassles, bringing all those contributions in. And to Tim, obviously, for taking the time to be here with us today. And I hope Charlotte is doing well. She's sorely missed amongst our discussion. It's one of the things I've really enjoyed during our projects, is having those discussions. My contribution to this particular book is about China's own approach to its inbound foreign investment and some of the dynamics around its outbound investment. However, in other projects and activities, I've been studying Norwegian approaches to accepting foreign investment and also Chinese economic instruments, commercial and aid-like, in other parts of the world. So my kind of take on that is obviously informed by various sources. But when it comes to China's own, how it has itself dealt with its own foreign investment, that's a story of a growing economy that has been, emerging and growing since the late 1970s, where economic security and an active industrial policy has been there all along. So a quite considerate kind of template of policies geared towards building an economy, learning skills, building technologies, but also protecting certain sectors from too rapid kind of involvement or internationalization. So you can see from the late 70s and up till recent times that those regulations have kept changing, but the kind of central mode has been there all along. So in a kind of a Chinese mindset, economic security considerations, which we are now actively discussing in Europe, are of course something that have been there all along and has been part of the Chinese modernization. And the very short story is that foreign investment into China has been an essential part of its economic growth, and China has for the last 10, 15 years been one of the leading actors both when it comes to receiving foreign investment and investing outwards. Some of that we have experienced here in Europe and here in Norway, but it's really a global activity. China is a real global major great power that is active with its economic interests all over. However, there are a few things that make the China story quite unique and I think uncomparable to other countries. And one of the main reasons for that is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is, of course, is a part of China, handed back from a 100-year kind of lease to the UK in 1997, and has been ruled under the one country, two system since then. So it has been governed, and especially in the financial field and when it comes to the legal apparatus, as much more of an international entity, exposed and experienced with all the international laws and all the international cultures around investment, but of course also being Chinese. So you can see, if you look both at the inbound and the outbound investments up until this day, that the growth and the flows are quite parallel between those two. And of course, there are also other so-called tax havens or places around the world that are used for, also by Norwegian companies and other, for having very advanced or smooth services for accepting and making transactions around investments, have also been one of the major destinations, both from the inbound investment and from the outbound investment coming in and out of China. And a lot of Chinese companies have both used and established themselves in Hong Kong, but have also used these other so-called tax haven or investment centers also for placing Chinese capital out of China and bringing it back, which also plays into the Chinese regulations around it for investments, but also around its more kind of general political economy climate, where it has been all along quite strict on regulations, but a lot more flexible on those terms of practical and informal ways of making business happen. And up until recently, that has functioned quite smoothly. However, in the last a few years, or in the last decade or so, China has also moved in to regulate much more strictly, and also to stop or kind of tighten some of those loopholes around those formal, informal regulations. Having said that, China has also opened up in some of the sectors and also removed some of the restrictions around the inbound investments, and also actually made more opportunities for international investments in some of those industries that have up until very recently been very protected. And that, of course, is also a reflection of China, of course, also having experienced a sharp fall in international investments in the last few years around the pandemic, but obviously also related to some of the geopolitical tensions and uncertainties also with the Chinese market, the Chinese economy also being challenged by a lot of its transformations. So we're now in a situation where we are looking to see how kind of the China will keep existing as an attractive place, part for international companies to invest. Right now, it's not such a rosy picture, but there are also indications in some fields, for instance, on some of these high-tech digital technology fields, where there's actually quite an upbeat interest, also from European and to some extent US and other Arab countries' investors. When it comes to its outbound investments, when in many ways parallel the flows inwards, is of course driven by different types of incentives, but it's also very much a reflection of China becoming the second largest economy in the world, on its way probably to becoming the largest in the next few years, and a very rapid internationalization of Chinese companies in several fields. And also quite a lot of large Chinese private companies also investing in our markets, but also in the global south and countries that are a lot less developed, but seen from China has a relatively promising outlook, and where the investments from Norway and Europe and the US are very scarce. And now just in the last few weeks, we're obviously in a situation where we have the second term of Donald Trump. And we have already seen quite a few new, not really new developments, but kind of continued indications of a continued scrutiny around its own investment climate, particularly dealing with China, and also including in that is of course Hong Kong and Macau, which are part of China. We see that reflected also in discussions in Europe, where the security policies around both investment and trade and other forms of economic interaction have been developed quite rapidly in the last few years, and Norway in many ways reflect that development. But we're also seeing a more kind of fresh also take, as you alluded to in your conversation, Jakub, is also how we're going to place ourselves in and between two economic rivals internationally. And one of the things that I am looking or very interested in a kind of bigger picture is, of course, also how China's kind of economic growth as a real global entity evolves, where other types of markets and other types of companies around the world might also find new opportunities within China. Chinese companies might find new opportunities outside of China in a climate where European and US actors are more restricted in how they can approach that market.
Thank you very much for your very insightful comments. I was very glad to see that you decided to address those questions from a kind of very broad historical perspective. Those three P's that you mentioned as the driving ideas behind the Dutch policy is very much something that has very deep historical roots. On the other hand, I would also expect, for instance, that the Chinese experience of those 100 years of humiliation that are at least officially one of the key ideas informing Chinese foreign and security policy is also something that had also some impact on the Chinese thinking about how to meet this challenge and opportunity of foreign investments. So I think that we have gotten a kind of very nice picture presenting how those questions are addressed from the point of view of a liberal, less fair-driven economy, and one, how those issues are addressed from the perspective of authoritarian regime that wants to have a complete control over developments inside, but at the same time needs to take into account the very positive impact the economic cooperation with the rest of the world has had on the development of the Chinese society. With those conclusions, I would like now to open the floor for your questions. We have like 10-15 minutes to come with some discussion, and please, I see that you were the first one to raise your hand.
Thank you, Jakob. My name is Liv Monica Stubholt. I'm a business person, but I've always been very active in foreign policy security questions out of interest. And shady past in politics as well, but that's a long time ago. So I have two quick questions for both of you. Tim, it's super interesting to hear about the Dutch nation being such an important host for foreign direct investment. Now that you've been working also with Norway, which has never really focused on attracting foreign direct investment, we've been much more interested in focusing on exporting our goods and products. How important do you think that a focus on trying to attract foreign direct investment, how important will that be to successfully continue to attract foreign direct investment? Because we don't want to cancel it, and I'm sure you don't want to cancel it in your home country, but you just need to be more cautious about it. How do you see that different approach? So that's for you. And if I may, Jakub, just a quick question for you. Outbound Chinese investment, very interesting. I read you to say that don't always look upon it as sinister, trying to colonize other countries and put sensors in our technical gadgets. It's normal growth for the next biggest economy in the world. Do I read you correctly?
Thank you for a very relevant and interesting question, to which I'm not sure I have a complete and definitive answer to, but I do have some thoughts to offer, which boil down to the following. If you look at history, then you see that coercive statecraft, like spies, seldom travel alone. That was a reference to Shakespeare. And what I mean by that is that I've studied military coercion. Wrote a book on military coercion 1920 to 2020, and you see that it comes in waves. I think the same applies to economic coercion. Even more so, because tit for tat and beggar thy neighbor policies and imposing restrictions are even arguably more easy to do than deploying military force, specifically for smaller and middle powers. So what I expect in times such as these is that we will see, given the events over the past couple of weeks, this is kicking in an open door. We will see greater prevalence of course statecraft, which will definitely lead to, I don't want to say decoupling, but I would want to say fragmentation. And the question is to what extent we will see fragmentation and along which lines. With that, the nature of our global economy is entirely different than it was 100 years ago. So in 1914, we had the highest levels of globalization, but that was really about import and export, and it wasn't in terms of actual MNCs with 200 different places and foreign direct investment. Well, you just described the Chinese guys. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that tit-for-tat dynamic in such a world plays out. Now, for the Dutch, if you have 3.5 trillion, and you think, am I saying so much money? If you have that, and let's also realize that we have a lot of these firms that bring it in and bring it out again, due to the laissez-faire nature. But you're not gonna, if you look at regular flows, that's not gonna be evaporated or gone, even if you don't put as much restrictions as other countries do. So I don't have my crystal ball, but what I would expect is two things. I would expect further pushback from MNCs and from investors in putting too much restrictions on everything. That will slow down the process. And two, I think you will see a reorientation and redirection of some of these FDI flows. And there, I'm going to stop and leave the floor to my neighbor.
Very good. Just before you got to that. No. Thank you for the question. It's obviously always exciting where somebody listening to what I'm saying is not only hearing what I'm saying, but also hearing between the lines what I'm saying. And you're absolutely correct in the sense that I now think I hear what you said. China is the world's second largest economy, is by far the biggest producer, exporter of goods, is by far the biggest maritime nation in the world, and is by far the biggest exporter of relatively advanced electronics. And in order to kind of support its growing economy, it also has to invest, particularly in greenfield investments, but also in investments that facilitate that trade and also build into the value chain. So in one perspective, what China is doing internationally, it's perfectly natural for a growing economy, as other growing economies have done before, especially those that have been so export-oriented, is to invest in more market facilitating capacity around the world. However, having said that, China is obviously a very authoritarian country and have for a number of years moved in definitely a more authoritarian direction. And so obviously there are security-related implications that need to be dealt with. Especially in liberal societies that have a tradition for having open and open economies, but also liberally based societies. So when it comes to having overview and information and having systems in place to track and screen, I'm very much on board on having a very well-regulated investment system. But when it comes to actually preventing or stopping certain types of investments, I'm probably more inclined to see more of those as an expression of a natural kind of economic activity than something that's necessarily done with the motivation of performing intelligence or having influence work or some of those other activities that we obviously want to prevent. So it's, although you heard me correctly, it's still a two-sided story. Obviously, investments from China have to be considered with different lenses than investment from countries that are part of our political security collaborative networks.
I see that there were also two persons asking questions. I would like to propose that we take both questions in the same round, and then we will most probably have some time to answer, although the time is about to run out for us. Please, Kåre.
Yes, my name is Kåre Dahl Martinsen. I'm a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I had the, I would say, rather mixed pleasure of being a kind of expert witness for the Screening Commission. I had 2 or 3 long conversations with them, and one of the problems there was that, if Charlotte Hafstad had been here, she would probably be able to address many large loopholes in the Norwegian screening law. Regrettably, she's not. But what the problem was, and I sense it somehow here too, is that it's a danger. We run a danger as a small and open economy if we normalize China too much. And I would like to mention 3 examples of that. In 2011, China purchased Elkem, which is producing polysilicate, which is a godsend gift to the Chinese defense sector. The Chinese couldn't have been happier. That was a purchase that was done at the time when we were in the deep freezer diplomatically in Beijing. And we thought this would be a kind of door opener, which it was not. When the fence area, Fensfeltet in Telemark, was discovered containing a lot of rare earths, a Chinese delegation came to the Prime Minister's office and asked to be able to purchase the entire field. All of it. Probably all of Telemark too, I don't know. And it's difficult not to see this as part of Chinese economic warfare. As was hinted at by Gåsemyr here, China is moving in an authoritarian direction. Well, that is to put it mildly. The new Chinese security law and the enterprise law has made sure that the Communist Party's control of the economy is stronger than ever before. And then let me mention the last example of Chinese purchase in Norway, which was, I have to say, surprisingly rejected by the Prime Minister himself, was when China wanted to purchase parts of the harbor in Narvik and in Kirkenes. And in the case of Kirkenes, I am pretty sure it was a telephone from our now much maligned American ally saying that this is impossible. If we are going to assist you, you can't have the Chinese blocking the harbor. So I would say that although I can hear from Mr. Bolt that it's necessary not to regard all Chinese investment as sinister, I would really like to know why not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this was a very big question. I think that we are going to address this question in the next project, and we can also promise to publish a book on those questions, but I don't think that we have the ability to respond in detail this question, having in mind that we are already over time. But you also wanted to ask a question, please.
Svein Flote, civil engineer. I've been working in the oil industry for 35 years. I'm very occupied with the same topics as you have. It's a very interesting project you have. I think you're learning a lot of things we need. From that time, I learned that we need to always create robust backups in procurement and what we were buying, and to secure that we have stability in the long term. It's just like the braking system in the car. We now have a dual braking system since 1965. That we need anyway for terrorism, fire, breakdown, sabotage. I think that should be more in vogue and should be more introduced also on the general level. I think also this reciprocity principle is important. Like you say, if one company introduces TIF laws, learn from that, use that bilaterally. At the same time, I think for Norway and Netherlands, it's important to uphold the free trade principle. They're really earning a lot from that and should keep that as long as possible.
Thank you very much. So I understand that this was not, those two statements were not necessarily to be framed as questions, but rather as comments to what we have been talking about today. And I think also that if you want to have some final statements, please feel free. But if not, then I will somehow close this event, and hope very much to see you, many of you, on another occasions at NUPI. NUPI has just moved to new location, and you see that we have refurbished and are open for new events. And so thank you for coming, and hope very much that this project is going to continue in one way or another, because we have heard and raised many interesting questions that deserve closer attention from the academic community, even maybe more so from the policy-making community. And we this event has been streamed, so what we have been talking about is going to be available on NUPI's YouTube website for many years to come. If you somehow feel that you need to refresh your memories, please go to NUPI's YouTube channel and look into this from this perspective. Welcome, and see you next time at NUPI. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So if you...
Yeah, I find it hard to read the cultural code. Am I being invited to address the...
yeah, if you want.
Okay.
Film is still running.
Okay.
Is it? Yes. Yeah, I thought it was also funny. I didn't know it was recorded, but that's great. I'm happy to hear. So, few remarks then. I mean, there's a whole debate, of course, whether there's a need to securitize everything. But I can give you a number of examples in the Netherlands case that are, you know, parallel examples, cases of the stuff that you mentioned, sir, which include China purchasing parts of the port of Rotterdam, which includes over 100 Chinese PhD students funded by PLA or PLA-related institutions going to our premier technical university, Delft, which is one of the best technical universities in the world. And I think it makes perfect sense, not would make perfect sense, makes perfect sense that we are putting restrictions on this for security reasons, national security reasons, but also apart from national security reasons, letting people sort of having access to secrets, you also got to be very careful not to create strategic dependencies on states that you're not on a very friendly basis with. With that said, I don't think that necessarily extends to all fields and all domains and all areas in which So I don't think there should be a Chinese wall, pun intended, between the European economy and the Chinese economy. But we need to be very careful as to what precise sectors we're monitoring and also how we do it. Because I was just telling you about the Dutch example, but mind you, that still extends to a notification duty for a company. That's different from a proactive screening mechanism in which you would have a screening agency overseeing everything, but it makes people more cautious. And then the final remark, and that is the following. Neither Norway nor the Netherlands can prosper alone and can stand up, whether it's against Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, or Donald Trump. So the real solution here is ultimately to stick together, and we do have in Europe a perfect vehicle there, which we call the European Union, and which also in the economic field has been developing its anti-coercion toolbox since many decades, but specifically since the Iranian nuclear deal failed. And we wanted to shield European companies that wanted to do business in Iran. We set up that vehicle. I mean, the European Commission set up that vehicle. European companies still didn't dare to do business in Iran, mind you, but the vehicle was there. And so the Eurocrats, and I mean that in a complementary, positive way, these really smart civil servants started developing this toolbox further. And now in December 2024, the European Commission has adopted its anti-coercion instrument, which does not only pertain to adversaries, but also speaks of protecting Europe and being able to retaliate, I don't know whether that's the word used, but against extraterritorial sanctions of friendly nations. Well,
very good. Thank you.
All right, so I'll be very, very short. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And to Martin, and this, Charlotte is sorely missed. She would be able to go right into those legal discussions. And I think I'll just repeat that I think I share the view that we need to have very good systems for flagging and tracking and knowing what's going on and having thorough discussions around those types of investments that might represent security risks. However, we will, coming from our different types of perspectives, our backgrounds and so forth, probably consider quite a few of those investments with different lenses. And one of my reasons for not believing that restricting investments too much is a way forward is simply because I don't think that's going to protect our societies. Because the rest of the world, outside of NATO, outside of our kind of closest collaborative networks, is going to keep developing. And that's where the real economic growth is. So the more we restrict and the more we close down, the more we will also close ourselves off from the interaction that we will have to deal with, whether we like it or not, if we want to still be a robust and internationally oriented economy. The companies and the services associated with China, with India, with Arab nations, they're not going to disappear. They are still going to be there, but we need good systems to know what we're doing, to know what's coming inside, and having thorough reviews when security issues are exposed. And that, of course, also include activities in the High North and any other part of the Norwegian territory that are also more sensitive to the national securities that we obviously also have to deal with very carefully. But those types of debates are things we should have, and which is very legitimate, and which is by definition being an open democracy. So obviously we should debate China and other countries and their investment patterns, both towards Norway and Europe and the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. I see that the team has also put another controversial topic on the agenda, the issue of sticking together by joining the European Union, which will most probably open for new types of discussions, at least in this country that is very much on the brink of realization that maybe the idea of having this discussion is has arrived. Thank you very much.
Now the film is
Okay.
Worse and worse and worse. All right, I'm so sorry that we're not able to spend more time.
But I will take care of